Hello everyone, I am Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this Halloween special episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a ne'er-do-well commander from the Brothers War Transformer crossover, Megatron Tyrant. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support your channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to this villainous episode. Megatron is a 7/5 artifact creature robot for 3 generic, 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black. He has a sax effect that prevents opponents from casting spells during combat. Keep in mind that this isn't just combat on your turn, so they won't be able to cast any spells during any combat step for combat tricks, removal, responses, etc. Another ability tied to combat that he has is that at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, you gain 1 colorless mana for each life your opponents lost that turn. Be aware that with the way it's worded, it's not limited to combat damage, so you could deal a ton of direct damage before combat and then convert Megatron afterwards to add a ton of colorless mana to your mana pool. This effect is something I took a lot of advantage of with this deck. If all of that wasn't enough, we have to see what it means to convert. Megatron has an alternate casting cost via the More Than Meets the Eye ability. When you cast him for that cost, you're casting the backside directly, sort of like having the option with those modal double-faced cards. However, unlike those modal double-faced cards, these Transformer cards can actually convert between the two faces, as can be seen here. That being said, the mana value for Megatron Destructive Force is still 3 generic, 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black, like its front side as if it were a normal transforming double-faced card. A bit clunky, I know, but an important distinction nonetheless. In any case, this side has Living Metal, which means that even though it's a vehicle without a crew cost, it'll be a creature while it's your turn. If you do want to crew it at anyone else's turn, you need to run something like Astro Bearer of Blades in order to literally give it a crew cost. Otherwise, if it's still a vehicle in anyone else's turn, you can't turn it into a creature unless you also literally animate it with something like Karn Silver Golem. And then you'll see why knowing this side's mana value is actually an important piece of information. Back to how to use this side, whenever you attack with him, you may sacrifice another artifact. Doing so has him deal damage equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value to target creature. Any excess damage dealt this way is then dealt to its controller's face. Afterwards, Megatron is converted back to his non-tank form. I also made the most of this effect in order to really maximize how much direct damage Megatron is dealing. This actually made for a pretty interesting deck, since I was trying to overlap not just how much damage to deal before combat, and combat as well, when the card is in its front side, but also trying to maximize the damage dealt by its backside. And not just that, but the ability requiring an artifact to be sacrificed is something else I took into consideration when building the deck. I know that was quite a lengthy introduction for the commander, but as you could see, it's quite a wordy card. So let's start with making the most of the backside, Megatron Destructive Force, since that's the cheapest side to cast thanks to Megatron's More Than Meets the Eye ability. Since this relies on artifacts, the deck is very heavy into artifacts to try and synergize as much as possible with them. Since we're sacrificing our artifacts to fuel its triggered ability, the deck is running Trading Post, Skeleton Shard, Mirror Retriever, Workshop Assistant, and Junk Diver as ways to recover artifacts from the graveyard. Skeleton Shard can only recover artifact creatures, but that's still good because most of the deck's creatures are artifacts, plus it can also recover Megatron itself, which is great on its own. Trading Post can also be used for other things thanks to its other modes. This card does a ton of work here. The artifact creatures here are amazing as well. You can sacrifice them for whatever reason, not necessarily to Megatron's trigger, and you can recover any other artifact in your graveyard. This can help sort of provide a revolving door of artifact recovery. Nim Death Mantle, Resurrection Orb, Cryptek, Iron Soul Enforcer, and Fallen of the Third Path also provide recovery effects, but much better since they're straight up reanimation effects. Nim Death Mantle is amazing because it also provides a buff and a form of evasion, but you need to have 4 mana open to pay for its triggered effect. It's still amazing because it's not dependent on the creature being an artifact. Same with Resurrection Orb. However, this one doesn't require you to have 4 mana open to use it. You just have to have it already equipped to the creature. You can then use the 4 mana afterwards to re-equip it. Cryptek is dependent on the creature being an artifact, but that's okay since most of the creatures in the deck are artifact creatures anyways. At the very least, it helps keep Megatron immortal. Iron Soul Enforcer is amazing since it can be any artifact and it gets reanimated so long as either it or Megatron are the only attackers. This might be a slight drawback, but well worth it if we can cheat a fatty onto the battlefield or an oppressive artifact, which we'll soon see. Felton doesn't reanimate per se, but he does create an artifact token copy of the creature in our graveyard. Since it's a copy of a creature, it will also have the creature's mana value, which is super important for Megatron's ability, since the damage depends on the sacrificed artifact's mana value. Mimic Vat is another way to create creature token copies if we imprint a creature on it when it dies. While we can definitely use this with our own creatures, we can also just essentially steal one of our opponent's amazing creatures and get a token copy whenever we wanted to. Bonus points if you're imprinting an artifact creature, since Megatron will have sacrifice fodder each time he attacks. Goblin Welder and Scrap Welder can also reanimate artifacts, but at the cost of sacrificing one, also providing a revolving door for artifacts between our battlefield and graveyard. While Scrap Welder is a nerfed Goblin Welder, it's still useful if we're creating token copies of larger value artifacts in order to reanimate lesser mana value artifacts from the graveyard. In any case, these two goblins do a ton of work. However, Goblin Welder is still king here. Wake the Past and Brilliant Restoration do it better by reanimating all of our artifacts from our graveyard. While the deck does it best to protect our board state, sometimes that board wipe will resolve. So long as no one follows up with Graveyard Hate, these spells will set us up potentially better than before for the board wipe. Brilliant Restoration is very difficult to cast with that quadruple white, but the deck has plenty of dual type lands that can be fetched for, so there's really nothing to worry about too much. Same with the Mana Rocks, but we'll see those eventually. As for what we want to be recurring back and forth, how about things like Spine of Ishsop? Consistently recurring this back and forth is very backbreaking, especially since it can hit lands, so how evil you want to be is up to you. But most of all, it costs 7 mana, so it will deal 7 damage with Megatron's ability. And since it has a built-in recovery trigger, it'll come back to our hand. So not only is it amazing at being indiscriminate spot removal, but it can also be used to great effect with the previously mentioned goblins. So good. Draco and Scion of Draco also have formidable mana values, but while these costs might seem super steep, their domain ability reduces them significantly. Even so, they might not seem that good in a 3-colored deck, since we can only achieve a domain count of 3. However, we're able to run Yavimaya Cradle of Growth in this deck, which I do. While the deck has plenty of ways to reduce the cost of artifacts and artifact creatures, Yavimaya doesn't really take up a slot in the deck. Yes, it gives us a color we don't need, but almost all of the artifacts in the deck have a generic cost anyways, so it doesn't really matter for paying generic costs. In any case, these artifact dragons can deal 16 and 12 damage respectively when used with Megatron's ability. Draco does get sacrificed if we don't pay that upkeep cost, but that's fine since the deck has plenty of ways of recovering and reanimating it. This might seem like a lot of work, but 16 and 12 damage is nothing to scoff at. Orborg Tomb of Yawgmoth is still included to help with those hefty black costs, since a lot of the deck is heavy in black. Just like Yavimaya, it doesn't take up a slot, so you might as well. Back to Revolving Doors, cards like Solemn Simulacrum are great to recur back and forth. The deck only has 3 basic lands, but we still draw the card when it dies, so we can ramp any basics we're missing until we get them all, and then draw cards afterwards. It does have a mana value of 4, so it's not negligible damage that Megatron will be dealing. Lastly, Bosch Iron Golem is included as redundancy for Megatron's backside. Keep in mind that Megatron converts back and forth depending on the trigger. So if we wanted the backside's effect but we're stuck on the front side, Bosch can do that for us. We do have to pay 4 mana each time though, so keep that in mind. Bosch is also pretty big, so we can sacrifice him to Megatron and even himself in a pinch. While this might make it seem like the deck is too heavy in terms of mana value, it is running plenty of cost reduction effects like Cloud Key, Foundry Inspector, and Joyous Familiar. We'll always be choosing Artifact when Cloud Key enters the battlefield, since most of the cards in the deck are artifacts. Joyous Familiar has the added bonus of also reducing the cost of our non-artifact legendary spells too, which is amazing here. Mycosynth Golem, another high mana value artifact, won't ever be hardcast for 11 mana since it has affinity for artifacts. Not only that, but it also gives all of our artifact creature spells affinity for artifacts too. That goes amazingly with Biotransference. Not only does this enchantment turn all of our creatures into artifacts, but any creature spells we're casting and any creatures not on the battlefield. Combined with Mycosynth Golem, we can cast any of our creatures for super cheap. On top of that, our creatures in our graveyard are also artifacts for all of those previously mentioned recovery effects for artifacts and artifact creatures in our graveyard. So good. It also synergizes with Megatron, since that means we'd be able to sacrifice any creature to its ability, regardless if it's an artifact or not. Mycosynth Lattice is also included for the same reason, and this one turns all of our permanents into artifacts. Unfortunately, it only does so for our permanents on the battlefield and not anywhere else. But that's fine since it also affects our opponent's permanents, and we'll soon see how the deck makes the most of that too. On top of all of this, it also lets us spend mana as if it were any color. Sure, that also benefits opponents, but it's pretty helpful at casting that Brilliant Restoration we saw earlier. But our board also being all artifacts is great for cards like Darksteel Forge and Leonin Abunus. The Forge gives Indestructible to all of our artifacts, and Leonin Abunus gives Hexproof to all of our artifacts. If Leonin Abunus is also an artifact, then it gives itself Hexproof, which is just icing on the cake. These cards help a ton at protecting our board state from wraths, even though we can still recover pretty well from most of them. Not just from the Wake the Past and Brilliant Restoration we saw earlier, but with non-synergistic effects too, from cards like Boros Charm, Teferi's Protection, Flawless Maneuver, and Tybalt's Trickery. Not everything has to be absolute synergy, but this suite of interaction is surprisingly amazing considering that the deck isn't blue. We can either protect our board via the 2 previously mentioned permanents, recover it all with the previously mentioned 2 sorceries, or any of these for instance. People tend to forget about Tybalt's Trickery. While this is basically a chaos swap for spells, it does amazingly against an opponent's board wipe, especially if it's an overloaded Vandal Blast. Speaking of, you can be as evil as you want once everyone's permanents are artifacts. That goes for Vandal Blast and Karn the Great Creator. Vandal Blast is already an amazing card in the format, but overloading it when you're controlling Mycosynth Lattice will pretty much guarantee that your opponents will scoop. Resolving Karn while you control it pretty much does the same thing. That being said, these cards are amazing on their own and are still worth including. It's up to you how you want them to interact with the other pieces of the deck. Karn being able to recover any artifact from exile is amazing since exile effects do exist. Aladdin, Hellkite Tyrant, and Treasure Nabber also have the potential of being exceptionally evil when running Mycosynth Lattice, especially Hellkite Tyrant. Not only can this win you the game on its own because of how many artifacts you're running, but successfully smacking an opponent will steal their entire board. If they understandably scoop, you will lose all of those goodies though. Treasure Nabber is amazing on its own for stealing mana rocks, that we can then sacrifice for our own value, but with Mycosynth Lattice on the field, we can steal any tapped land for mana until end of turn, lands that we can then use or sacrifice for value. Aladdin is also amazing on his own. We can either choose to keep the stolen artifact or sacrifice it for value and then steal some more. The ability is quite costly as well as Aladdin, but how often can you say you're running him in a commander deck? Lashiel Clockwork Scholar is another way to make the most of all of our creatures being artifacts since they won't take any combat damage when attacking. This means we can attack with our commander as well without worrying about it dying in combat, so even on its own is great. Best of all, it also cantrips us whenever an artifact creature enters the battlefield under our control. Unfortunately, that only triggers once per turn. Bummer. Canoptech Spider has a similar trigger and is not limited to how many times it happens per turn, which is amazing. It's also a 4/4 flyer for 5 mana, already surpassing the vanilla test. This card does some serious work here, and it can even be sacrificed in a pinch since it has a good enough mana value. Best of all is being able to copy it. So good. Speaking of copying, Mishra's Self-Replicator is an absolute house here. If we invest that additional 1 generic mana each time we cast an artifact or legendary creature spell, we get to copy it. Again, recall that token copies retain their mana value. This means that we have a near limitless source of sacrifice fodder for our other effects, but especially for Megatron and Bosch too. 5 damage is no joke. If we're targeting small creatures, that's a lot of damage left over, all for just 1 generic mana. Archetype of Finality and Vault of the Archangel make it so that Megatron only needs to deal 1 of that damage with his ability. Giving Megatron Death Touch is amazing since any damage beyond 1 is considered excess. Gaining lifelink from the land is an amazing bonus, especially since the land doesn't take up a slot in the deck. We can further take advantage of sacrificing our artifact creatures thanks to cards like Skullclamp, Dark Prophecy, and Liliana Dreadhorde General. While the last 2 will always trigger an unlimited amount of times and without investing mana, Skullclamp does require you to have it equipped to the sacrificed artifact creature first. It does only cost 1 generic to equip at least, but this card does a ton of work here. Liliana's other abilities are amazing too, but she's here mostly because of her triggered ability and first 2 loyalty abilities. Ruin Grinder is another way of drawing into a ton of cards, but the effect is global, so keep that in mind. It's best used when you have few cards in your hand or want to discard a lot of fatties into the graveyard to reanimate later. Speaking of, it itself is an amazing reanimation target that we can get into the graveyard for just 2 generic thanks to its mountain cycling ability. So for 2 generic we can get something like Savai Triumph into our hand, reanimate it, then sacrifice it for value. The 6 mana value into damage is no joke. Going back to more Mycosynth Lattice synergies, Cranial Plating and Nettle Cyst are amazing for when attacking with Megatron. The backside doesn't have the same power as the front side, but it does need to attack to get the trigger, unlike the front side, so you might as well make the most of it. And what better way than to give him an obscene boost in power. These artifacts do a ton of work. These are why the indestructible artifact lands are also included. While the dual mana ones come into play tapped, it's not that big of an issue since they're indestructible. They still synergize amazingly well with the deck, so they're worth keeping. The deck is already mid-range, so it doesn't need to be turboing along anyways. Speaking of synergistic lands, combining either of these equipment with Rogue's Passage and you're essentially guaranteed to take out an opponent, commander damage or not. While you only need 21 damage with the commander, whichever side of Megatron that is, these 2 equipment add such an insane power boost that any other large enough creature might deal enough damage overall to simply kill that defending player. Inventor Sphere, another amazing land in the deck, can also help out with that. This is already easy enough to get online. Then, once you do, you can tutor for any artifact in your deck. Whether you want Mycosynth Lattice, Darksteel Forge, any of these equipment, or anything else you might need. In fact, thanks to Biotransference, you can also tutor for absolutely any creature in your deck, whether they're a printed artifact creature or not. Lastly, sacrificing artifacts with Megatron means you know I have to include my favorite black enchantments. Dictate of Erebos, Grave Pact, and Martyr's Bond are included. While the first two only trigger on creatures dying, the white enchantment triggers for any non-land permanent, so any non-creature artifacts will trigger it, having opponents sacrifice an artifact to it. But if our creatures are artifacts as well, they'd have to sacrifice either or, while the first two force them to sacrifice a creature. These enchantments do a ton of work here, not just at forcing sacrifices, but at potentially clearing the way of any potential blockers as well. Phyrexian Scriptures and Organic Extinction can also help us get rid of potential blockers since they destroy all non-artifact creatures. Keep in mind that while these are amazing once we control Biotransference, you do not want to cast them when Mycosynth Lattice is out on the battlefield because they won't do anything. This combo isn't enough to exclude them though. It's not like we're going to always have Mycosynth Lattice in every game, so they are still good to include. At the very least, these two. Granted, Ruinous Ultimatum will wipe our opponent's boards and only their boards save for their lands, so this is the board wipe we want to draw into most anyways. Resolving this is quite oppressive and can very easily turn the game in our favor. 7 open mana is dangerous not only in blue decks, you know. Chaos Warp and Generous Gift can take care of those pesky lands, particularly lands that remove attackers from combat. The deck has Voltron potential, so we want to deal with them. Same with any other busted lands as well, like Gaia's Cradle, Serra's Sanctum, Rogue's Passage, Kessig Wolfrun, etc. While first casting Megatron as its backside might seem like the best course of action due to him costing 2 generic less that way, and since most of the deck's synergies are based on this side, we can also just cast him for his front side first as well. This might make the deck further seem like it's high on the mana curve, but there are plenty of cost reduction effects as previously seen, as well as mana rocks in it, which help us along. So you could, for all effects and purposes, first cast Megatron as the front side if you want to get that burst in colorless mana first, especially since it's not restricted to combat damage. This makes cards like Heartless Hiratsugu especially busted. The amount of colorless mana you can generate is ridiculous thanks to him. With the way Megatron's trigger is worded, you don't even need to attack with Megatron. You just have to choose to convert him when the trigger enters the sack at the beginning of the post-combat main phase, and then from there use all that colorless mana to help cast as many generically costed artifacts as you want. And that's just synergistically speaking. But imagine Heartless Hiratsugu with lifelink thanks to Vartal the Archangel. Super busted. That generic mana can also be partially invested into Aggravated Assault. This is amazing because if we're getting extra combat steps, we can be converting Megatron back and forth with each subsequent combat step. However, we still need red mana to activate Aggravated Assault, so we might not be able to do this indefinitely. Fortunately, Neheb the Eternal is included as redundancy for Megatron's front side, just like Bosch is redundancy for Megatron's backside. Neheb alone is enough to potentially activate Aggravated Assault indefinitely many times, but combined with Megatron and we can be generating a ton of mana in our post-combat main step. Enough to keep those beefy artifact spells that we're drawing into or recovering back into our hand from the graveyard. As mentioned earlier, the deck is still running mana rocks like Soul Ring, all 3 talismans, and all 4 signets to go along with the cost reduction package. While relying solely on artifacts for mana acceleration is quite risky, the deck has so many ways to protect our board like previously shown that it's not something to worry too much about. And even then we can recover them from our graveyard as well. We can even use them as sacrifice fodder when we're already generating a ton of mana. So they're useful whether in the early game, mid game, or late game. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 9 fetch lands, all 3 shock lands, all 3 snow duels, all 3 slow duels, Savai Triumph, Command Tower, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 1 of each basic land. Blood Moon effects don't really hurt the deck that much, since we can still use the red mana and it can also be used to pay for generic costs, plus the mana rocks will still tap for colored mana. They're still good to have not just for Solemn Simulacrum, but any of our opponent's effects that have us ramped for basic lands as a consolation prize. As with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Megatron Tyrant. He's one of those commanders that has an avalanche of text but isn't that obvious how to build around. I love commanders like that. It keeps opponents on their toes as to what exactly you're going to be doing. In my opinion, the best commanders are those without a clear path of how to build around. So you could definitely build Megatron in a completely different direction than I did and still get an amazing deck. That being said, if you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Better Kirby, and happy brewing.